I'm Richard Marshall. I am, as Richard and Dave introduced, I was ex-Gartner. I've been running as an independent operator. I've also been an entrepreneur for a long time. And I do have a PhD in computer science, which did start in the days when one of our classes still used punch cards. But a lot of the learnings there are still relevant. So I'm a techie by background, and I love programming activities but abstractions and descriptions of things. And this is a very, very exciting time for us to be, because there are these forces of change, which is what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to talk particularly about the platform. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm talking to myself here. Go on. There we go. Right. I do have a clicker and it wasn't changing page. Oh, the joys of technology. Anyway, so the forces of change are things that have been around for a while, but have been massively accelerated. So massive change in the way that the workplace is organized. So I don't think we need to go into that. Richard hinted about some of it. I love that cartoonist cartoon with the wrecking ball coming in and people saying we suddenly accelerated all of our activities. And I've got a slide about that later that has some statistics on it. But the workplace is changing dramatically. So talking about lots of screens, that's a small part of it. But then the collaboration and how do we work? And there's a lot of stuff that's been happening in that area for a long time. And the more advanced companies have been working very well with things like collaboration tools and remote access and people being able to work asynchronously, which is a hugely important topic, asynchronous work. And there's a lot of people who are stuck in an old paradigm. And as we go forwards, I am convinced that that paradigm is changing. That paradigm is absolutely going to be moving towards more distributed asynchronous work with different ways of organizing it. And this has all sorts of incredible impacts going forwards on commercial real estate values, office commute, climate, everything. Lots and lots of stuff happening there. So that's one for massive change in the workplace. This is matched by an equally powerful change in how we organize the workforce. Now, the workforce, meaning the people, how do we organize our people in a way that it's effective? Because as I'll talk about later, haven't really changed it very much since Henry Ford created scientific management, as they call it, Taylorism, you know, that all kind of thing. The workforce is changing dramatically. Again, it's stuff that's been underway. The more advanced companies are using it, debugging it, as it were, and then the larger companies are starting to adopt it. Oh, I've lost the focus again. God, you're going to love this. Yay! And then agility. Now, as software engineers, we can be giving ourselves a pat in the back because the concept of agile with a capital A has really come out of software, and it's now diffusing out into the rest of the world. And this year has really shown how important business agility is. And business agility is just going to grow and grow and grow. So that is a really important topic for people to be learning about and applying in not just development and sprints and all that kind of stuff. It's applying it to business principles as well. That's really important. And that's an opportunity that we as technical people have because we're familiar with that. We also have an opportunity to change the way we do stuff in automation. Now, I've been a big fan of low-code tools. I actually built a low-code tool for building interactive websites back in 2000. And at the time, nobody wanted to even look at it. And I've been talking to Richard Evans and the rest of the Alpha software team for a long time about the importance of low-code and how low-code is really going to change things because we have huge demand for software. We just don't have very good tools for delivering it. And that is the fourth pillar, if you like, of these forces of change that's coming in. And this is what I'm going to be talking about through the rest of the presentation, is looking at how these four pillars are pushing together or building, depending how you want to put it. They're going to form a substrate onto which we can build the resilient enterprise. And resilience is hugely important. As we've seen this year, most companies were not, or many companies were not prepared. They weren't resilient. They couldn't change quickly enough. As a result, they have had extremely difficult times. Other companies have been very successful in transforming themselves and surviving. And most of us in technology have been lucky because it's kept going, but not everybody has had that luck. Now, let's pick up with workforce to start off with, and the empty office. I love this picture, and the first time I used it, I suddenly realized that there's a bottle of wine sitting on the table behind one of the screens there. It's a stock shot of an empty office. I didn't expect it to have a bottle of wine in it, but it's funny. But anyway, let's have a look at history. So some things have been around for a long time. One of them's dodgy comb-overs like this guy in the front here. But we moved people into workplaces off the land a long time ago when we were farmers and everybody worked on a farm. And then the factories were horrible places to work, but they offered warmth and protection from the weather. And they offered money, which working in your family farm didn't. So people moved in, it was actually good conditions. And you had to go where the high value equipment was and where you could turn around and talk to people because there was no alternative. The equipment was very expensive and there was no means of communicating with other people out there. And so if you had to do something, you had a runner, took a message, or you walked over and talked to them. This got extended into more modern looking offices like this one. Why are these women, and it is women, it's an old photograph, sitting in the typing pool? It's because A, the people with dictating didn't know how to type, and B, typewriters were an extremely expensive piece of equipment that belonged to the company or were rented, and therefore they went to where the equipment was. And this paradigm continues. So this is probably the 60s. These enormous adding machines, great fun, tung, 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 drunk, and it would go lots of noise. And again, it's fascinating in this picture because if you look at most of the desks, there's no telephone. It was done by paper. Even in the telephones were quite common. So there's the lady there on the right, you can see she's got a phone, and then there's another one further behind her and a couple of others, but most people are still communicating on paper. And then we started to give people more equipment and we put us all into cubes. And you know, that wasn't a very good workspace, but this is the evolution of land. Work is still based around this basic Taylorism model. And even though these people have got devices to communicate, relatively modern phones, have got computers, they're still physically adjacent. And the most recent iteration of this is something that looks somewhat like this. Now, I've spent some time working in a WeWork. It wasn't quite as cramped as this, but it was pretty close. So the idea still was that you had this physical proximity. People would be all communicating around the same area because they're in the same space. And that space got smaller and smaller and smaller. And these lovely stock art pictures give us some indication of what people think work's actually like, although I can't imagine anybody manages to do any productive work in that situation. Then something happened. It was a pandemic. And many of us have been working remotely for a long time. I mean, I first started working remotely in the 1980s with a dial-up modem to connect in, early 90s, not that long ago. And of course, we're all working from home. This event's happening remotely. And this is our day-to-day experience, and it's a big change. And it's a very important change because it changes the balance. It takes people, the work to the people rather than the people to work. And that's a fundamental change, but it's not new. If you're not familiar with Buckminster Fuller, he was an amazing inventor back in the 1930s who created the geodesic dome and things like the Dymaxion car and the living house, which is the top picture, the bottom one's a Dymaxion car, which is a wonderful thing if you ever get a chance to see one. Quite astounding piece of design. Anyway, and he made the very sound observation all the way back in 1936 that our offices are used half of the time, but our living rooms are only used 1/7 of a time. How could we rebalance this? And what's actually happened is that because of the pandemic, we've had this massive switchover, which was overdue because we no longer relied on runners with bits of paper to convey messages between each other. On the other hand, Buckminster Fuller probably did not anticipate that this is how some people would be working. This is Gretchen TG, who was talking live on CNN about health in this picture. So this was taken while she was actually live on air broadcasting. And of course, it looks like it's a very professional headshot. If you see the other direction, it's a professional headshot with a nice background. There's an alcove behind her with some works of art, etc. But this is the reality for people. So we need to be very cautious about assuming who can work effectively and how they work effectively. And earlier in this year, I came up with this concept of a hierarchy of remote working needs based on Maslow's hierarchy. And so it starts at the bottom with connectivity and devices, and it works its way up through establishing how best to have patterns of meetings and calls and how best to communicate through to things like the security, document protection, data loss protection. How do we establish trust? Very important topic. And then how do we work better? How do we use more apps that are adapted to this style of working, then up into the ability to actually create stuff for yourself, and then on into self-care, so that tools that enable you to spot people who are maybe having mental health issues, etc. But an awful lot of companies are still stuck down in this red band. Interestingly, Slack just published a document a few weeks back, which has a very similar model based on the pyramid of needs. And it starts with these low technical needs going up to the high human needs. And this is how we need to think about companies going forwards. Far too long we've been considering people cogs in the machine. We need to move, and this is a quote from McKinsey of all people, we need to move away from thinking of organizations as machines and thinking of them as living organisms, so that there's evolution, there's human factors involved in it. It's not just about super efficiency and fitting in there. And a large part of this drives the concept of digital working maturity. And it's really important to understand that people have to move up through this hierarchy as the companies establish better ways of working. So one of the things that was really interesting was everybody in this audience, I'm sure, is technical, and therefore you've probably been quite comfortable working from home. You've had all the equipment, whether you want to or not, it's a different matter, but you would have the capability. You understand how it works. You understand the risks and the capabilities. We're unusual, and it's important that we try and put ourselves in the feet of the people who do not have that level of experience. So I was quite interested to see this survey that was done by Deloitte and reported through Forbes. There's a link at the bottom, to see that 76% of companies were still in what I call the survive and restart phase. That's to say they haven't figured out how to stabilize a form of a future business. Notice I say a form, it's not going to be the final one. That's going to keep changing as all the stuff happens. So looking at this, it's really important to think of this as a normal distribution. And in fact, those of us who are up there at the top doing self-service, which by definition this audience is because you're looking at alpha software, there's still an awful lot of people down in that bottom end that haven't even started to understand how this works. And unfortunately, that is very often senior management who, like me, are pale, male and stale, as the expression goes, who are familiar with sitting in a corner office and don't actually have a very good understanding of how people in their business do their day-to-day work. And they hanker after going back to being able to see people out there. If they can see people, they think they're working. And that's a group of people who need a lot of help going forwards. And we see the maturity curve going through here, and it's our job as IT people to actually make things that help people move through here. There's lots of interesting tools out there. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of collaboration tools, some of which are very good, some of which are very deeply integrated and replace things well, easy to adopt. Very important to start looking at these things and be able to help people push up that hierarchy based on mutual trust. And trust is something that I picked up on several years ago, actually, as a key element, because very often trust has been lost between employees and employers, both directions. So the loyalty that used to exist between people who go to work for a company and they'd be there for the rest of their career anyway, that's gone. And likewise, there's a disbelief that people are actually performing, which is one of the things that drove people into those communal working spaces. As a manager, I'm typically sitting outside where everybody else is working, looking in, and typically I have a desk that faces out while everybody else's desk's facing in, so that I can walk around and see what they're doing. That is not trust. It's not effective. We have to build models of trust. Now, this comes from both sides, and all of the surveillance technologies are out there, really bad idea. It's really important to look at how can we build trust between the people doing the work and the people managing it, supervising it. That's something that is very difficult to handle, and it's a very much evolving model. Now, I love this because I think this is a strong set of rules and suggestions about how you should establish that trust. And it comes from Lego. If you ever get the chance to visit a thing called Lego House, which is in the city in Denmark where Lego was founded, it's different from Legoland. It's not the same. They have a big sign up, and they have this sign in every office. I don't know whether they have them in the remote offices or just the central offices, but you have these 11 paradoxes of management. And I'm not going to read through them all. I've posted it on LinkedIn, and I'm sure that Alpha will be posting these slides if you want to see them. But it's this contradiction. So, for example, be able to establish a close relationship with your employees, but to keep that proper distance. That's about trust. And down at the bottom, it's to be self-confident, but to be humble. There's a lot of people talk about the servant leader model. This is kind of predating it. This is actually quite an old set of rules. They're very, very effective, and I can only really suggest that you should apply these as much as possible if you're supervising people. So, workforce is changing dramatically. We really need to put in place what we could call remote first thinking. So we've had mobile first, we've had web first. Now we've got remote or asynchronous first is another way of looking at it, because you don't know where anybody is, but you also don't know when they are, if you like. So they may be off doing something, they may not be at their desk or whatever. It's very, very important to be looking at this concept of everything has to be open and available. And this is where mobile apps in particular and the ability to create them quickly comes in very, very strongly as a means of succeeding in this market. So how are we going to achieve a lot of this stuff? It's by being flexible and supportive. One of the things that I think is tremendously important is that many senior managers have been forced to communicate with their staff from their kitchens. And one of the wonderful things is getting to see into people's houses, see their pets, see their kids. It makes people into humans, and it breaks down a lot of barriers. And that's a really important thing. Traditionally, most corporate communications are kind of strangulated and constipated and full of highfalutin terms that people are looking, and they're trying to make management seem more important than they actually are. And this is an opportunity to reestablish that human relationship. So if you see that your manager is sitting in their spare bedroom, and I was watching a Microsoft briefing the other day, and one of the senior execs was sitting in this tiny room with bunk beds beside it, and then other people with their cats and all the rest of it. This is creating an incredibly powerful bond between people by being informal, by being continuously in communication, giving people the information they need. You also have to be ready to adopt new ways of working, new rituals. When should you have a meeting? When should you have a Slack message or whatever? When should you be on WhatsApp? When should you send an email if anybody still sends email? It's very important to look and see what works, because we don't necessarily know what works at this point, even though we've been going on for this length of time. And working between supervisors and individuals is super important here, because that is how we establish that trust, how we build these psychological safe spaces. And managers must adopt this concept of confident vulnerability. They must be able to say, I got this wrong, I'm sorry, I didn't understand to do this, I need your help too, and look at these things. And finally, we need to be measuring output as at least one measure rather than the number of hours or keystrokes or lines of code or whatever. Now, output may not be the perfect metric for everything, but we really need to get away from measuring input. We need to be measuring the output in that sense, so that somebody's doing something and being creative, then you have to agree measures for it, rather than assuming somebody's at their desk at 8:30 in the morning and they've done 100,000 keystrokes by 5:30. That is not how you manage people, and unfortunately there's all too many people looking at that. So the workforce, very, very important. So now as we move forwards, we're going to start looking at the workplace, where obviously people are. Now, one of the fascinating statistics, and it makes me weep, this one frankly, is this was from Wall Street Journal. In 2019 there was $1.3 trillion spent globally on digital transformation. 70% of it was thrown away and useless, and that's because a lot of it was done as random acts of transformation, as my friend Karen Hobart likes to say, and it's also delivered in a way, but it's not user-centric, it's not employee-centric. It was just stuff that people, either gee whiz technology or whatever. That money could be used much, much better. And a beautiful example of that was way back at the beginning of the year. I think it was March, maybe Richard can pick up after this, and Dr. Warren J. Wexelman used Alpha Software to create this COVID-19, oh, it says COVID, oh, there's a typo in here, risk app. And it takes you through the symptoms and says how high risk you are and whether you should get tested or not. It's still there, you can see it there. This was built in days, right? This was really quick response. If we look at Office Depot, they moved to curbside collection when their stores were shut in 48 hours. That's digital transformation. So you could place the order, pick it up. The number of moving parts involved in an organization that size that you need to make that work is just absolutely amazing. And similarly, one of the fascinating things that Alpha's been talking about is how paper is a transmission vector for COVID-19. So you want to get rid of paper. So GBS, it's a company that supplies to both professional organizations and consumers, and they were eliminating paper forms by moving into using digital technology with Alpha. Did it very, very quickly. So that's protecting the customers, protecting the employees, and eliminating a huge amount of cost associated with paper. Again, done really, really quickly. Now, I mentioned Karen Hobart a minute ago. I'm going back to Karen with her 3 elements of digital transformation. So we talk about digital transformation as if it was a homogeneous single entity. It's not. It's really divided into 3 areas, and this is a very, very good way of dividing it up. So digital business, this is how we interact with our customers and partners and suppliers and etc. How does that work? Is it automated? Is it paperwork? Do we do refunds by writing checks to people? Do we have to have somebody go into the office to pick up checks and go to the bank? And that's a very American thing, by the way. Here in Scotland, I can't remember the last time I saw a check. But anyway, how do we digitize those processes without making humans become involved in them? Because they slow things down, they're expensive, they make mistakes, and they're at risk of catching the virus at the moment. Then we move into the second element, which is digital work. How do people work? What processes do we have? Do we have to fill in pieces of paper? How do you book vacation days? Easy example. And we've seen that transformation of the process of claiming expenses from you had to fill in a piece of paper and give it to somebody in the accounts department. Then you filled in a form that looked like the piece of paper on screen. Now you just take a picture of it and it disappears off into the system. You get refunded at some point. That's a digital transformation of one example of a process, but most of those systems are still sitting in that fill in the form that looks like the paper one, except it's on the screen. And then finally, the last element of the 3 parts of digital transformation is digital information. A lot of people talk about this as data, big data, whatever. It's about where's that information? Can I get to it? Can I use it? Can I actually get some value from it? Can I get access reports? Is it freely available? Is it linked up? So that's the 3 elements, and it's a very important basis for thinking about these things. So anytime that you're looking at a transformation process, you need to break it up into these 3 elements to understand where it sits. Now, one of the key elements of that middle one, which was digital work, is refreshing your employee experience. Now, as individuals in our private lives, when we want to learn something new, what do? Typically go onto YouTube and look for a video. How to put a shelf up straight, for example. How do I do that? I go and look for a YouTube video or I search online. How do I knit a scarf? I go to YouTube and I see how to knit a scarf. Why aren't our business systems based on that same model? And it's a really important aspect of how we actually deliver stuff. And so we want to do search first. So I want to book vacation days. I should be able to just go book vacation days, and it'll come up with a chatbot form or whatever. If I say, how do I, what's my expenses allocation for going to Canada or whatever it happens to be, then I should be able to get that information. It might even be a video explaining how to do it. And all of that has to work remotely. So it's not linked to your office network. It's got to be secure and run over the air. It's got to go outside your firewall. Keep it social. Social media is really important. One of the jokes I always make at this point is if we had our enterprise systems in an app store, how many of them would get 5 stars? None. I think it's safe to say none. You might get a few 3, 4 stars, but the vast majority of internal systems are 1 star. Putting in feedback and allowing people to point out that things that don't work, etc., is hugely important. And that's why we have a massive increase in the quality of most websites and products. We need to apply that to ourselves within IT. And one of the ways of achieving that is what I call radical simplicity. And an example of that is the Google homepage with just that search box. Type the thing in and bang, off you go. And creating that level of simplicity is actually really, really difficult. It's much easier to make a complicated, difficult to use experience than it is to make something that is deeply simple. But that's what you need to do. And remote thinking, mobile thinking is really important elements of that. So you're probably thinking, how on earth can I afford to do any of these things at this point? Budgets are cut and everything else. So the first step here, really importantly, is to understand how much you're spending. That might sound stupid, but there's lots of tools out there that help you understand how much money you spend on coffee every day or whatever. But not too many people understand their IT budgets in terms of what the delivery coming back is. So that's the first step. Understand your spend. Then the next thing is have a look and see how much of that spend is actually used and do a Marie Kondo in your internal system. So I doubt if they spark joy, but frankly, if they're not in use or hardly anybody uses, get rid of them, throw them away. That's a difficult thing. Finance people and a lot of IT people like sunk costs. They like the traditional system. They don't understand that they may be holding you back. So it's really important to go out and have a look at these things and understand what it is you can get rid of. combining systems as well. Lots of people get stuck with multiple versions of the same kind of software because they've been through mergers and acquisitions. So they might have multiple learning management systems, multiple accounting systems, multiple tracking systems. You need to merge those, and then you can cut the license costs. And then you need to look at optimizing how you spend that money. And traditional corporate licenses are very expensive for many things, and they're fixed. You can't change them year to year. Most modern software is usage-based, and as Richard was mentioning, one of the things that Alpha Software has just done is you can develop the app for free and then just pay for Alpha Cloud usage. So if your usage goes up, you pay more. If it goes down, you pay less. This is, in times of crisis, that's incredibly useful. You're not stuck with fixed costs. And the last element of looking at this is you need to put an investment mindset in place, which is difficult. 70% of IT budgets are spent keeping the lights on. That's not much left for in new stuff. So what we need to do is get rid of a lot of those fixed costs and then spend more money investing in maximizing return on investment. So some concrete actions from this section. You need to really refresh the employee experience because it drives up engagement, reduces errors. Slack has found that most of us spend 50 minutes every single day looking for information because it's all over the place. We need to fix that. We need to get rid of systems that are either no longer fit for purpose or too expensive or nobody uses them. We all know systems like that. They sit there, everybody's trying to turn them off, figure out what you can do. Optimize access to licenses. Look for SaaS equivalents of things which are going to be cheaper because you can scale them up, scale them down as you might need to with the size of your company. And then don't forget about security, but don't be driven by security. Now, I'm sure there's CISOs and other people out there twitching at that, but the reality is it's better to get the job done in a moderately safe way than it is to lock it down so that nobody can actually do anything. So moving on into automation, definitely running a bit longer than the 30 minutes. Sorry, Dave.
Oh, you have plenty of time in the session, so please don't worry about it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So automation is a really important thing, and I'm not talking about robots like they are in this picture. I'm talking about software development and delivering software solutions. Traditional software development is broken. Now, when I started learning code, one of the things I loved was that we just built all our own class libraries. So you needed a linked list, you just write a linked list, and that kind of mentality sadly hasn't gone away. We're taking too long to build things. They're delivered after they're needed. Takes too long, too expensive, and it doesn't scale. We have lots of problems out there. Things are built in silos still. We create log jams because the IT department wants to release everything at the same time because it doesn't trust the deployment. Stuff is not remote friendly or mobile friendly because it's stuck in the paradigm of being on a desktop computer in the office. It doesn't support digital transformation, and a lot of things are still running on old stacks of technology. A lot of new technology gives you all of the other stuff for free. So if you're using something like Docker, for example, as a framework for building applications, you get all that management stuff for free, but you've got to get there. So traditional development is kind of scary, scarily broken. And if we think back in time, we used to write everything in assembly code because that's all there was, or indeed assembly code was the thing that moved off from binary. And we kind of got stuck at the next stage, and which I tend to look at as being traditional hand coding. So unfortunately, typically, if you look at most IT people, their reaction is, how could I write this in Java or C# or whatever? So they think automatically of this traditional hand coding, and it's a hand screwdriver, whereas we have no-code and low-code tools out there, which are like the power screwdriver. Now, I can't imagine there are too many joiners that are still using the hand screwdriver, or contractors or builders. The occasional very fine carpenter might use one for small things, but for most jobs, the power screwdriver is what you want. And that's what we have in low-code. So it's really important for us to understand now that software development is a spectrum. It's been a spectrum for a while. So looking at it from one end, you got no code. So for example, Microsoft terms are looking at Power Apps, and through at the other end, you've got hand coding with Visual Studio. Now these things are a spectrum. So the person on the left is very much intended to be a non-technical person who can put together a process. And at the other end, you have somebody who is a deep expert who can optimize things and build very complicated processes. Now, this is a model that's been around for a while. The people on the right don't like the people on the left doing things because they don't trust them. And typically, we can see a three-dimensional space around this of objections. So objections aren't all wrong, of course, but some of them are very emotive. People are worried about their relevancy, because if you spent a long time learning how to program in a particular programming language, it's kind of scary to throw that away. They're also worried about the unknown. They're unfamiliar with it. They don't know how it's going to work. It's new to them, even though a lot of these tools aren't particularly new. And there's also a lot of emotional investment in that delivery. We've been delivering stuff like this for 20 years. Why should I change now kind of mentality. Technically, there's also a lot of risk of, they don't have the relevant skills. They're frightened of being locked into it, and there's a risk of destabilizing the environment by deploying something new and unknown. Now, the reality of modern software development is that that's unlikely to happen because it's a containerized solution. And then financially, sunk cost. The finance department doesn't like changing things. It doesn't like getting rid of stuff you spent for. And they're worried about disrupting financial flows, and that they are likely to block budget for doing new stuff. Now, those are all good reasons. But we have to see what has happened as we go forwards. This year has been amazing. And I think this is maybe the same report as Richard Rabbins was talking about. This is from McKinsey. It was published on the 5th of October. And they went around and they measured how long people said they thought it would take to do something pre-pandemic and how long it actually took to deliver it. So we have increase in remote working and or collaboration, time to respond to or implement. Expected 454 days, actual 10.5. So that's a multiplication factor of 43. Now, the interesting question we have is that now we're delivering these applications and services, systems, solutions, whatever you want to call them, 43 times faster. As an industry, we can no longer go back to delivering stuff in 454 days, because the users can rightly turn around and say, well, last year you did it in 10 days. Why is it going to take so long now? And there's some really interesting stuff in here, because we're talking about big company changes happening really, really quickly. The slowest factor here, which was making your supply chain more redundant, hence more resilient, is 18 times the speed that had been expected. And this is a huge issue around scalability. So typically, applications have been built in 3 batches. So you get single user stuff like Excel spreadsheets. And yes, I'm in the UK, and I'm sure you've seen all of the insanity around people using 17-year-old unlicensed versions of Excel to exchange critical health data. Inexcusable. But that's a perfect example of stuff at the left-hand edge of this wedge. Things were designed for simple applications that were only used by one person with a limited amount of data. Then typically there was an expectation that as that grew into use by more and more people, it became more and more unwieldy, more and more insecure. Then you would rewrite it using some kind of database tool like Access or something like that. And then that would spread from that department into others to the point where it again would get unreliable, it didn't scale. And then IT would take over, and the person on the right-hand side of the spectrum would come over and rewrite it by hand and make a complex application that scales. This is the scalability challenge. And it's interesting to see that new tools such as the Alpha Suite actually take you all the way through here because of things like Alpha Cloud and the ability to write the application, deploy it to the cloud, and you don't care how it scales. It just does it by magic, right? Dan will be explaining later what that magic is. There's lots of really cool stuff in there, because what you're now doing is focusing on the solution rather than the implementation, and you're not worrying about how it's going to scale up, but you have that assurance that it will reliably scale up. So it is hugely important that we look at these tools to enable us to take very simple things and accelerate that development and deliver the solutions in that 43 times faster than we traditionally have. And these tools will bring with them all of the stuff that we've been looking for. They're efficient because they make better use of developer time, so you can put the specialist onto the thing that really needs specialist. By default, they create things in modern architectures that will scale and that give you high performance. They're all API focused, so it should be easy to integrate. They should also have easy development paths for deployment. And naturally, all of these tools are modern, so that they give you a proper multi-channel, remote-friendly kind of experience. So it's really important that we start to look at these new approaches to development and modern architectures which help deploy and scale new tools. Not everything, as it says here, needs an expert. it's very important that we go through and find people who are understand the solution and can deliver it. And then we reserve the people who do the tough stuff for when we need tough stuff. And it's really important to balance up and make a level of equality. There's remote equality is an important thing for the workplace, so that people are in the office and people at home have an equal access to the systems. And similarly here, we need to balance up between people building applications for themselves and those across the teams. And to enable that, we have to do something very challenging, which is we have to talk to business users and we have to understand, and they have to learn to understand us, so that there's a mutual exchange. And we really need to look into how we can keep that learning continuous, the delivery continuous, and the updates continuous. Now, moving on to agility. Agile has been hugely important. Now, one of my favorite pieces of research work of all time is the chaos report by the Standish Group. For a very long time, they've been measuring project success, or more likely, project failure. So typically, only 44% of projects are on time. Typically, so on budget. Typically, 60% of them do not deliver on time, and 44% of them do not deliver what was expected. And it's really interesting to look at this. It's been consistent throughout the years that they've been doing it. This is for 2011 to 2015, when they changed into a different format. But the figures that go from before that are very similar. And one of the things that they looked at is that year to year, it doesn't really change. The number of failed projects, 22%, bounces around the 20 there. And we're not really getting very much better at it. So we're successful. But what they then looked at over the last few years is they started to look at the size of the project. So the grand, typically government scale projects, only 6% of them did what they were supposed to do. That's pretty dismal. And if we look down to small projects, so the sort of little project that's contained and understood, 61% of those were successful. And that is a strong indication that we really need to start looking at delivering smaller sections of a project at any one time. Now, I know some big projects need to be put together, but it's really important for us to look at different ways of doing things. How do we break projects down so we can do them more quickly and more reliably and more predictably? It's a good report. You can get a lot of the old information for free by going to the Standish Group, signing up. And there's also a wonderful report that I like to talk about, which was the Big Ball of Muds project, which was an academic project that said when you're working with normal coding practices, it always ends up a big ball of mud. There's nothing you can do about it. Again, focusing on with low-code tools, no-code tools, you can find out how it works, not how it works, but what it does. It focuses on the solution, and that's hugely important. And how do we get there? We get there by removing the ego. Now, Bill Gates famously said, we need banking, but we don't need banks. So I'm paraphrasing him and I'm saying, oops, sorry, hit the keyboard, I'm waving my hands around too much. We need management, but not managers. And one of the fascinating things about Agile with a capital A is that there is no project manager on it. Management is a service, is a function of the team. And this is an aspect that is going to go forwards very much. And again, even McKinsey in that same report is talking about this kind of model, which is moving towards holacracy, which was we move away from a job being a thing that sits in a hierarchy or a tree. You're not getting a requisition to fill a hole in the tree because we think we should have a tree there. What you're actually doing is starting to build self-managing teams. Now, they don't necessarily self-manage, but the individuals will take responsibility for managing aspects of it. But we want to have a balanced team. We want to have a balance of soft skills. We want to have a balance of technical skills. And we want to rearrange that we hire people, and people may be fluid between teams. So in a large organization, you might have somebody who's a user experience designer who only works 2 days a week in one project, 3 days a week in another one. It's kind of important balance. So how agencies work. We could call this the sort of movie model of the world, where people come in and out of different movies at different times when they're making it. This is a model that's been around for a while. It does scale, but it does require a huge change in senior management thinking, and that's always difficult. So this is a very strong thing that's been accelerating. It's actually statistics out there showing that this model of moving to the teams that have to come together automatically to solve a problem during the pandemic. How do we respond to this? Right, we're going to grab these people, and it doesn't really matter because they're now the structure. This is something we must stick with. We can't let that go back to the old way of doing things. So we really need to look at business agility. We need to focus on doing lots of small projects rather than big ones, because the big ones take too long and they fail. And one of the saddest things is that I didn't say why these projects failed, but the standard reason in that Standish report for all of these huge projects failing was no longer needed. Didn't meet the requirements at the end of the project. How sad is that? It's just horrible. You worked on something for 3 years and then they don't need it anymore. So much better working on small things, delivering them in incremental hops, putting them together. We need to move away from having a job function in a tree into a role function that moves around. It's fluid. So I'm a designer, so I go there. I'm a tester, I go there. And I see a project over there that needs my skills, I can go and join that one. And we need to look into continuous learning and exploring culture that helps us do that, because a lot of people are nervous about it. So it's not something we can just snap our fingers and then make happen. It's something that we really need to educate people around. So that is the 4 forces of change that I'm seeing. So we have the workplace, where digital transformation is changing how people are working. We're putting stuff together so that we can create collaboration spaces, we can be transparent, we can build trust. We're looking at the workforce, where we can see how people change the way they do things, how they're managed, how they're supervised, how their performance is assessed. We're looking at business agility, where business agility comes through, enables us to respond really quickly and 43 times faster. Sounds like a good advert. We should be able to deliver things as they're needed, and that's a critical factor. It's really, really important. And then how do we do that? We do that through automation. We use new tooling such as Alpha Software's tools. We use things like bringing in AI. We look at APIs. We look at RPA solutions, depending on what it happens to be. We look at automating the way we deliver the solutions just as much as automating the work. So we need to apply these approaches to ourselves. And these will enable us to create resilient enterprises that are going to survive this crisis, are going to survive the next crisis. And it's a mindset that enables us to grow into a more flexible way of working and to deliver excellent digital solutions. So I'm Richard Marshall. This is my company here, Concept Gap. I'm a member of the Analyst Syndicate, and I'm just going to go back to the previous slide there so you can see it in more detail. I am an independent consultant effectively, and I work with a lot of different clients, which is how I get to see this kind of overview of things. So I'm going to, with that, I'm going to hand back to Dave and Richard. I don't know.
Thank you very much. That was really terrific.